Digital Music Trends, episode 112, recorded on the 5th of December 2012. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Digital Music Trends. So, this week on the show, we're going to talk about Soundcloud, Turntable FM, music startups and discovery services, Comscore, and iTunes 11, amongst other things. But first of all, let me introduce you with the guests of this week. New to the show, I welcome Ben Sisario from the New York Times. So, hi, Ben, and hope all's good.
Hello, thanks for inviting me.
So Ben writes the Media Decoder blog on the New York Times website, which is always a great source of digital music stories. So I'll add a link onto the show notes and you can check it out then. And then I'm happy to have Mark Mulligan back on the show, one of the best known digital music analysts in the UK. So hi, Mark, and thanks for joining us. How's it going today?
Doing well, thanks. How about you?
All right, not bad, thank you. And also for Mark, you should check out musicindustryblog.wordpress.com and make sure you get the newsletter as well. And so third on the show today, we have Andy Malt, editor of CMU, which is a site covering everything surrounding the music industry in the UK, but also looking at the international angle. So hi, Andy, and thanks for joining us. Hope all's good.
Yeah, all's well. Thanks very much for having me back.
Great, thanks for coming. Also for Andy, the CMU brings out a great daily free newsletter. So if you want to keep abreast of everything that's happening in the music industry for free, you can head to thecmuvebsite.com/daily to subscribe to that. And introductions done, we can start off with the first story of the day. So lots of fresh news today to talk about, a lot of stuff that came out yesterday. The first thing I wanted to cover was SoundCloud. So the company's CEO, Alexander Leung, presented the latest stats on the web yesterday and officially rolled out the new iteration of SoundCloud to all users. So the beta was called SoundCloud Next. I guess it's just SoundCloud now. And it's been in beta for a few months, and it streamlines the user interface of the service, introduces features like reposting and sets that people can customize easily to curate a collection, a continuous play feature like a radio type thing, and an explore section that makes it easier to find new content. So I think it's a great redesign, and it really focuses on the element of discovery, which was kind of lacking. It was pretty hard to find stuff on SoundCloud that you loved. So what do you guys think about the new redesign? So Mark, let's start with you. Have you played with it before, and what's your impression of that?
Yeah, well, I'm a regular SoundCloud user, so I'm a bit biased in that. I love the site, and I started using it as a as a music producer. It's a great place to be easily able to put up sounds. It's clearly moved on a lot from where it originally was, and it's a bit of an anomaly. SoundCloud, it's an online music site with lots of free music, which isn't licensed, but is essentially sort of covertly embraced by the music industry. And the reason it did that early on is because it filled a very clear market need. Now, and obviously at the behest of its investors, it's trying to push out wider to a broader consumer market. Yeah. I think all of these features are very much geared around that. And yes, there's a very delicate balancing act which SoundCloud is continuing to tread, and will get all the more difficult now as the more popular it gets and the further away it gets from its record label artist core origins. Yeah. The more difficult it will be able to stay in the market without having licenses.
Yeah, sure. And Ben, what's your take on the new version of SoundCloud, and what do you think about its growing user base and also reach of users?
I think all the redesign is great. I like what they've done with it. It's slicker, the nice features. My question about SoundCloud is just about the usage of it. I wonder how many people simply go to soundcloud.com and poke around and would use things like the continuous play from track to track and all of that sort of thing, because I think mainly till now, its main function has been the embedding, and its ability to be a streaming service that can be plopped in anywhere, and it's tremendously successful at that, and there's nothing better. And I think, as Mark mentioned it, that was a very critical need. They've mastered that. I don't know if these improvements will necessarily have anything to do with that. I just think the question for SoundCloud is, does it have any use beyond an embedding feature, and will anybody care about that stuff?
Yeah. Andy, what's your take on all this?
Well, I agree with everything that's been said, really. I've been using the new version for a few months now, and I really like it. The only thing I really find quite annoying is the continuous play feature, actually, because generally I go to SoundCloud to listen to one specific track, a link that someone sent me to something, and when it carries on playing after that, it's not really something I want. And I don't know whether, I mean, they're clearly trying to position it as something else, as like a radio or a music discovery thing, but how useful these features are really to its users, I don't know. I mean, the interesting thing Alexander Lung said in his presentation was that they want to be the YouTube of audio.
Yeah.
But I think YouTube is already the YouTube of audio, so they've kind of got their work cut out for them.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that there is a market gap there, as Mark said, in terms of how you position audio within the internet ecosystem, and SoundCloud has clearly filled that void. The question is now, as they're reaching up to 180 million users with their widgets and embeds, and the probably the latest numbers, I think they were like 20 or 25 million users back in May. They haven't released new numbers on how many actual active registered users they have on the platform. So it's moving into a more of a consumer interface mode from where it started, when it was more of a musician's platform. Does that create, because we all know about YouTube and all the issues it had with licensing and all that, does that create an issue now of the balance that Mark was talking about in terms of how they tread the balance between being a tool for musicians to promote themselves and being an actual consumer-facing service where they might actually start being seen more as that than as a tool?
Yeah, I think it's a definite shift away from where what their original product was, and I think they probably I suspect they're already having some at least preliminary negotiations at the moment, because they can't not realize that there's something about to change in the way they operate. But I mean, I suppose they would always argue that they were a tool for musicians. They were selling something back to the music industry and offering something that was required, and therefore, they didn't need to pay licenses. But if they want to be the YouTube of audio, they're not going to be able to do that without having some sort of licensing deal in place, or licensing deals rather.
Yeah, I think the licensing. I think the licensing is probably inevitable, just for anybody at a big scale using copyrighted content in any way. For legal reasons, they're going to have to protect themselves. But I think the problem with the YouTube analogy is that I think it really only means that it's a source of a lot of streaming audio that is embeddable. I don't think that maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's changed, very recently. But I don't think it's really used all that much for unlicensed content. I think it still is very heavily used as a promotional tour for artists and as an outlet for labels and publications and what have you. And I think that if somebody wants to slap a song up online, I don't think they're going to use SoundCloud for it. I don't think it is terribly useful for that. And by that I mean, if Joe Schmo wants to just rip a song that, hey, I think this is cool, YouTube is better. YouTube is better for that function, and you can do the wacky slideshow and everything. And SoundCloud, I think its simplicity and its lack of a visual component means, I think, that it's most useful for people who are putting their own content up.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the unlicensed stuff, a lot of it, there's a big community of kind of young, particularly like teenage producers, a lot of whom are doing like unofficial remixes of tracks.
Okay, true.
And sharing them, and those are the things that are really like the kind of grey area licensed content that's really kind of becoming more and more popular on there.
Yeah, I'd add as well that you've also got content which is quote unquote licensed, where an artist is putting it up to promote a tour. More often than not, that is not with the express permission of the label. So and of course, an artist signs away the rights to the music. So the fact that it isn't always there by the permission of the label means it's not technically licensed. Also, there's plenty. It's still got quite a dance music or electronic music focus, and there's a lot of mixes which are uploaded to there, and again, things which include lots of unlicensed content. So I think it's the two. I agree with Andy's position about the if it's trying to be the audio YouTube, well, it's just at a time when the internet's going all video. So, you know, and we're talking about when are Spotify and audio and everybody else going to incorporate video. So I think there's a danger there by looking, you know, sort of building in obsolescence essentially. But I think the useful comparison with YouTube is because of YouTube's essentially blanket license, there's loads of content that gets on there deep in the long tail, which has never made it into formally licensed services. And I think, you know, that's one of the things SoundCloud does quite well as well. You know, things which have been played in radio shows and never actually made it, you know, to be released, or on small labels, orphan works, a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah, sure. And moving on from SoundCloud into a different startups, but still dealing with audio content. Let's talk about Turntable.fm. So there were lots of news about that company this week. There were a couple of stories that were actually a little bit confusing because there was a story on The Verge that was talking about a revamp of Turntable.fm. So they're actually revamping the site. They've launched a few new features, a new redesign, a cleaner interface. They allow more people into a particular room to listen to somebody DJing. So it's kind of a cool new revamp of that interface. But they've also launched a completely different service, which is part of the Turntable company, but it's a total spin-off that doesn't have anything to do with Turntable.fm, which is called Piki or Piki. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that. So starting with Turntable.fm as the initial service, how it started. Ben, what's your feeling about how they can re-engage the audience that they've lost in the past few months while the momentum has been lost?
I think I'm a little bit of a bear on this. I think it's going to be very difficult for them. I think that they're a pretty classic example of somebody that caught on within the bubble of early adopter people, and it trailed off from there. I think it's going to be very difficult for them to regain the scale that they had and to expand on it very much. Why? I'm not exactly sure. I mean, I think that the appeal of sort of gamified music, to me, is limited. I'm not sure how much people like engaging with it at that level. But I also think that there's something about the launch and the attention it got immediately, and the fact that just sort of as a media story, the way it was so celebrated when it first came out, and then the people who did the celebrating moved on to other things very quickly. And I think there was no more audience after a few months of people who are willing to write about it and talk about it. So. I don't know anything about the Piki feature that they're starting, so I don't know what to say about that. But I think that Turntable is a good product. I mean, I think what Billy and Seth and those guys have done is impressive. I just think it's going to be a big challenge for them to go anywhere with it.
Yeah, Andy, what's your take?
Well, in terms of Turntable FM, I agree. It was something that I think had a kind of limited shelf life because. It has that wow factor, sort of. When you first go in, that first time you used it, it was really good. But then there's not a huge reason to keep going back. And I think since sound drops come in, which I think does pretty much the same thing better, but does it as a bolt onto something else. So rather than Turntable FM is obviously a standalone service. Sound drop plugs into Spotify and makes everything a lot easier.
Yeah.
And in terms of the Piki. I don't know. TechCrunch gave it a very positive write-up, but having not having tried it, I don't know. Maybe it is the most amazing thing ever, but it kind of, I don't know.
Of course, it is.
They were talking it up as a kind of brand new, no one's done this before sort of service. And it looked like lots of people had done that before.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it's a standalone thing that as far as I can tell, requires all of your friends to be using it as well, which isn't kind of going to make it easy to take off.
No, exactly. Mark, in terms of looking at Turntable FM as a story, do you think it was more a victim of the difficulty in licensing music from content owners, or was it more of a victim of its own naivety in starting out that way without thinking about the consequences on the content front?
I think it's simpler than that. I think it's a feature, not a product. And I think when you've got APIs within Spotify and audio, and you've got companies like SoundDrop, you don't need it to be a standalone thing. It's a perfect feature within a streaming music service.
Yeah.
I don't quite know why there is so much hype around it. And no offense to the guys, but I think the story's run its course, to be honest.
All right. Well, I think as a segue to that, I actually wanted to link into a couple of the articles that have been flying around in the past couple of weeks regarding sort of negative takes on the progress of the digital music startup world. And they all got started sort of with some comments by Fred Wilson from Union Square talking about how he doesn't see really a licensed music startups to be able to really turn a profit. In the near future, he was talking about all the pitfalls that are related to that, how much funding is required. He was talking about $5 to $10 million dollars required as an initial round for a company that requires large-scale deals to be in place to actually begin service. And that got followed up sort of on a similar line by an article on Hypebot by Kyle Balin, who was writing about discovery and talking about the fact that there is a pool of dead startups that operate in the music discovery space. So this is pretty heavy going from Kyle, talking about a pool of dead startups in the music discovery space. His arguments were interesting and they were very challenging, but they were very well countered by Paul Amir from the Econest in another blog post, which pointed to some of the inconsistencies and flaws in Kyle's piece. So it's for me, I think I will always feel like music discovery is a hugely important piece. At the same time, I do understand that there is a whole host of startups out there that are using Econest data or Last.fm data and mashing them together and actually classing themselves as a service when they're really not. So what's your take on this subject? What's your feeling about music discovery? And do you think there's some truth in Kyle's post, or are you against that? So Mark, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll in reverse order just address the last bit about the risk of APIs. I think there's a real risk of sort of platform dependency, of startups who are essentially taking a developmental licensing shortcut by building their services around APIs with others. Now, that would be fine if these APIs could be guaranteed to exist in their current format indefinitely, but they're not. They're from funded companies, Econest included. Funded companies want exits. An exit typically means a trade sale. When you got bought by somebody else, they've got different ideas about what they want to do with the company. So suddenly the whole APIs that your product has been built upon could suddenly disappear. So I think there's a real risk of ecosystem dependency, platform dependency, and I think there will be, not anytime soon, but in 2 or 3 years' time, you'll start to see some of the big companies who've got APIs which everybody plugs into, starting to close those down a little bit or charging for them, whatever it is, because they've been sold. And I think that will be a really interesting turning point. Yeah. The issue of music discovery, I think is, I really respect Cal, but I think he's wrong on this one. I think music discovery is a problem that needs fixing. However, one thing which I do think is true is that most consumers don't think it's a problem they want fixing. And that's a huge problem. So I agree with a lot of his observations, but not with his conclusions. I think the observation that people don't really want to be told where to go, they don't feel that they want to immerse themselves in a discovery journey, all those things are true. To me, that simply says that nobody has worked out how to do that yet. And I think, discovery is going to work in a proper way. Most people, all of us here now, we're not typical. We're aficionados, we love our music, we want to invest the time in going and discovering new music. Most people aren't like that. But most people are sheep. They do want leading. So a really simple, easy, elegant way of driving music discovery can and will be a vitally important bit of driving music discovery, because the bottom line is there's far too much music out there. There's so much clutter. People need to be led through the clutter. They need the digital dots joining. So perhaps none of the ones who've tried to do it at the moment have managed it, but that does not mean it's a problem that cannot be solved, in my opinion.
Yeah. Andy, what's your take on this?
I think music discovery, I think, is at its best when you don't realise that that's what it is. If someone kind of puts something in front of you and says, type in artist A here and we'll recommend artist B, that isn't how you discover music. I mean, you discover music through like friends recommending it, or arguably radio is still the most important driver of music discovery, but people don't sit next to Radio 1 and think, I'm going to discover some music today. They think, I'm going to put the radio on, and then when they've played the same Rihanna song at you 10 times, you think, I might go on iTunes and buy that. And so, I mean, that does make it a difficult thing to do with technology, because traditionally it has been kind of, write something here, we'll tell you this. Yeah. But there are, there are routes through it. I think Sound Drop as well, like that's a good you don't go on that thinking I'm going to discover some music, but ultimately you probably will hear something new and think that's good, and it feels more like a recommendation from a friend or someone whose opinion you respect.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Absolutely. So Ben, what's your take on this? And do you think that on the one side about the music discovery, and on the other side about actual startups building their business on music discovery, is that feasible, or is it something that is a feature and maybe like a company like the Econest can pull off, having that as their data set and selling that data, but another company that wants to just build a service over that might find it hard to actually make it a viable business?
Well, these seem like separate questions to me. The investment question is a very different one. I guess in some ways it's tied to the discovery issue, but I mean, to me, they just seem like separate questions. I think I agree with what Mark said to an extent. I think Kyle's a very thoughtful guy, and I thought the piece came across as very sincere, but it also came across as kind of grouchy to me. And most of the piece, what was not an argument. It was kind of waving of a flag of something that he believes in. I think that the most effective kinds of discovery, as Andy was saying, is not if you like this, you'll like that. I think it's. I think Pandora is. Maybe you guys would disagree, but Pandora is very effective at discovery, and that's because it's like the radio, it's like traditional media, it's a feed, and it's not really asking you or suggesting, hey, if you like Radiohead, you might like this. It's putting it in front of you.
Yeah.
And I think iTunes is another one that's pretty good at it, and that's because it's a candy-colored interface that's sort of telling you this is something that's cool, this is something that you should be paying attention to. And the message there subliminally is not really what do you want to hear, but this is what you should be hearing. I think that it's kind of a fallacy to think that discovery has been discovery. For a long time, and people don't discover music by turning over a rock and saying, "Oh, look, there's music there." They hear it in the air, and if they like it, they like it.
Yeah.
So, I guess if there is a connection between these two questions, it's just that if your business is based on feeding recommendations to people or whatever, is that going to be a viable business?
Yeah, that's right.
Digital music startups face a lot of obstacles, and there's a lot of problems with the investment, and this is just one of them. So I don't think it can be separated from a lot of the other questions about licensing and all the other stuff.
Yeah.
I'll just add that I think one of the reasons why discovery services were more interesting from an investment perspective was because those which were pure discovery, i.e. those which weren't a service or a radio service or whatever, but just offering discovery, did not require and do not require record label licenses. So therefore, the investment is de-risked to a high degree. But also you're left with, well, if it doesn't require music licenses, that means it must need to formally coexist with other services within the digital music ecosystem, and then you end up with the risk of platform dependency as well. So I think Ben hit the nail on the head. There's a whole bunch of interrelated risk factors around investing in music, and the discovery for me hints at some of them, but it also hints at a wider thing, which is just VCs work on the basis that 1 in 10 of their investments work, 9 don't. Just happen 9 of those have been music discovery services.
I wondered, Mark, what you thought about Fred Wilson's comments, because to me, I rolled my eyes because this is a conversation that we could have had 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 8 years ago, and this is a perennial question of is there any money in digital music? Why do so many companies fail? So really, there's nothing new in that discussion, but I guess just as we go into 13, the question is, why are we still having this conversation? Why is the story not changed?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. We've been both in this game long enough to see this story, this very same story a number of times. I mean, first of all, Fred's doing negotiating in public. He's very much trying to sort of building an agenda. But the simple fact is that record labels have changed dramatically compared to 5 or 6 years ago in terms of their licensing approach. The difference is that they have been willing to take more risk, but in terms of strategy, but they have offset that by being more conservative with a commercial risk by essentially taking that risk from the, putting that risk straight onto a startup by taking a big chunk of their equity in terms of an advance. So what they're doing is, yes, strategically they're taking a risk, commercially they're not, because they're putting money straight under the bottom line. The VC and the startup have higher risk because there's much less working capital to see them through. So any startup 5, 6, 7 years ago, which wasn't having to pay a sizable advances, might have another year or two of runtime with their funding, which otherwise isn't the case. And of course, Beyond Oblivion, which just settled, that had $30 million worth of advances that it was due to settle. I get total, as I recall, 60 million in total, split between two majors. I mean, any amount of investment that's got to put that amount of money out of the business, is bound to be risky. So yeah, I think things can change and things are changing. But I think we're already, in my conversations I'm having with early stage startups who are in licensing discussions, they're already getting a more flexible approach from labels where they're saying, tell you what, spend the next 6 months just trying to get this thing out. Let's not do the licensing straight away. Come back when you've got a better understanding of the dynamics of your business, and we'll work things out there. So, I think it's probably a little to recognise. I think Fred Wilson is, he's, as I say, he's got an agenda to play out.
Yeah. But do you think that's a change in strategy, or is it just sort of change in the timetable in which they implement that strategy? Because sooner or later, whether they give them 6 months to play or not, there's a check that needs to be written.
Yeah. So the record labels are like oil tankers. You can see the iceberg ahead, but they need a mile to be able to turn. So I think this is, in my view, it's the first stage of a long process of changing their approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, Ben talked a little bit about iTunes, and I actually wanted to segue into that story for a sec, because you wrote a piece on the New York Times blog, was it today or yesterday, about iTunes and the rollout in 56 new countries. So let's start with that, and then we can talk about iTunes 11 for a little bit. So the rollout in 56 new countries, it's significant just because it's rolling out in a lot of countries that don't actually have a developed digital music ecosystem yet. And whilst a lot of people are looking at iTunes like a dinosaur, especially people that work in our field, they're like, oh God, streaming is taking over, iTunes is doomed, they have to find a new strategy, they have to find a new way. There's actually a lot of value. It's a bit like people that talking about the death of CD for 10 years. There's still a lot of people buying CDs, there's still a huge amount of people buying music off iTunes. So what's your take on this expansion, and do you think that Apple has to move on to the streaming model, or can they still make a lot of business through the digital download?
I think it's very important when iTunes, doubles the number of countries in which they operate. And I don't know about you guys, but I just at first was surprised that there's so many countries in which it is not there already. This has been around for a decade. They didn't release, unless I missed it, they did not release the full list of countries in which this has been launched, right? So, but you got to assume that there's a lot in South America. There's going to be a lot in Asia, probably Africa, just considering the number of countries. I guess my thought about that is I don't know if those countries are necessarily ready for streaming, because that's so heavy on bandwidth. A lot of these countries, the mobile use is really what what their sort of web diet is based on.
Yeah.
And I think downloads are a good model for people that spend their lives on their mobile phone, because it's difficult to be streaming music on your phone while you're driving around. But it's pretty easy to download your 20 favorite songs and listen to them for the next year. So I can see millions of people all over Vietnam and India and South Africa doing that. But this really, to me, this opens a whole can of worms about the globalization of digital music and the maturity of these various markets.
Yeah.
There's just, there's not a huge amount known about this. I don't know about the extent of the research that has been done, but there's a lot of big talk, and there's a lot of there's a lot of sort of fast action that's going on of people trying to launch in all of these countries. but we don't know how they operate. We don't know how consumers in Nigeria are going to deal with this, and whether it's going to be worth the investment.
Yeah,
it's a big question mark.
Yeah, absolutely. And Andy, what do you reckon? I mean, Ben raised a really good point in terms of the two-tier almost world in digital music, with countries that are getting increasingly used to a mass market adoption of streaming, and countries where that's not even technically particularly feasible. So what's your take on that?
But yeah, I mean, it's right. And if they're launching in kind of African countries, particularly countries that have developed in their internet usage later, are generally going straight to mobile. So yeah, it probably does make a lot of sense. I mean, I think Russia was a particularly interesting country to launch in for various, partly because as recently as a week ago we thought that launch had been delayed indefinitely.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a country not known for its willingness to go down legal licensed routes with its consumption of online media. So it will be interesting to see how well it takes off.
Yeah,
there.
Absolutely. And Mark, there's another point that's interesting, that the actual device cost for Apple is super high. So the consumption of music through iTunes, okay, you can do it via computer, but really the majority of people are going to do it via an Apple device of some sort, a mobile, an iPod, an iPhone, and that's still very expensive, especially for countries in the developing world. And they keep being every year rumors flying around of Apple working on a cheaper version of the iPhone, for example, for sale in China or in India, in those sort of countries, or in Africa. Do you think there's some chance that this may be true just because of the way that they want to expand their business?
So I'll say a number of things. First of all, Apple devices are not inherently expensive. What they are is that they are at the high end of each price tier, and they're in a lot of price tiers. So you can get yourself a Nano or a Shuffle. You can. Apple are very smart at always being the premium price point, but they manage to get down to quite cheap levels to get into. The iPad Mini will undoubtedly become quite a lot cheaper in the next year or two. So I think it will definitely always be the higher end of every segment they're in, but that doesn't preclude them from getting to some quite relatively low spending niches. And and you look at the experience of Nokia. When they first started expanding into India, they were finding, like 4 or 5 years ago, people were saving up the majority of their disposable income over 3 or 4 months in order to buy a Nokia smartphone. A lot of these devices become very aspirational, so you'll be surprised. Similar things have been seen with smartphone sales in Russia as well. So I think there's definitely the opportunity for Apple to drive the market more, and that needs to happen. You look at when I did a blog post about a month ago looking at how total digital music sales fell off a cliff in the top 10 music markets in the world when iPod sales started falling. I mean, it dropped from, just reading the numbers here, it dropped from an average annual growth rate of 85.2% year on year. In 2008, it dropped to 7% growth in 2009. It's massive drop-off. And yeah, streaming's, it's great to see the momentum, but streaming, let's keep a sense of perspective. It's only about 9 or 10% of digital revenues. It's tiny at the moment. And so I think that streaming is, of course, where the future is going to be. But it's going to take a long time. I was writing about subscriptions being the future of digital music back in 2002, and I almost gave up until about 2008 when Spotify came along and actually kicked the thing into gear. But it's going to be another decade before those things kick in properly. So downloads have got a lot of distance to go. And the final thing I'd say is the music market is consolidated around 2 products: CD and iTunes. 78% of music revenues in the top 10 music markets come from CDs and from iTunes. So whatever Apple does is going to fundamentally shape the shape of the music market as a whole in the coming years. So from that perspective, definitely it's going to open up good, new, much needed growth to the digital market.
Yeah. And Andy, people are talking about how Apple is progressing by default, just because they create this huge ecosystem and they're just going strong on the basis of that, and the hardware ecosystem as well, of course. Do you think they have the strength to move into a space like Pandora's in radio streaming and actually gather a considerable user base, or is there a risk of running into a ping scenario where they roll something out that is not quite baked yet?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, we discussed this last time I was on as well, and I think like Mark says, I mean, they have such a huge dominance in downloads. It doesn't make sense for them to go into streaming, which is still a new market and a market that's taking off.
Yeah.
It would be damaging for them to go in for the smaller companies that are kind of laying the groundwork there. In terms of whether Apple could launch something, they probably could if they really wanted to.
That's the big question, right?
But it's
and I mean they have with the download market. I mean that's the goose that lays the golden eggs, and they don't want to kill it. They don't want to give their hundreds of millions of users, and the labels. I don't think want that either. I mean, this is now Apple in the United States is the biggest retailer of music.
Yeah.
And sales, as Mark pointed out, are so much more valuable than streams.
Yeah.
So, it's a funny position that that Apple finds itself in with iTunes, because they will have to innovate at some point, but they're going to have to be well behind the curve here, because they have to milk downloads for what they're worth. And I guess for Apple, there's the other question of just, where do streams fit in their ecosystem of products?
Yeah.
Downloads work very well in their ecosystem, and they help sell products because they're playable on their computers, and they're playable on their phones, and the syncing of all their devices works well for downloads. But is there really any advantage when it comes to streaming? That's a question that I don't know the answer to.
Yeah, I mean, Apple isn't a content company. It's a hardware company, and iTunes exists to sell their hardware. If there came a time when streaming was more likely to sell iPhones, then they would undoubtedly switch to streaming. But at the moment, iTunes is still the thing that works for them.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, even if they see really interesting stats on their core, early adopter demographic, especially in the US and in the UK, shifting towards a streaming model, do they actually care? Because that doesn't actually imply that they're going to move platform or interface. If they change.
Sorry, I think it's important to keep a sense of perspective, and that is, the penetration rate here in the UK, probably the third most developed digital market in the world after the US and Japan. You've got, so after Korea, you've got a situation where it's around about 10 or 15% of people buy digital downloads. So 85% of the population hasn't even gone digital, music purchasing, let alone thinking about streaming. I mean, streaming is a minuscule fraction of percent of people in the UK who pay for streaming. Sure, lots of people use YouTube, but so if you're looking at how revenues are going to migrate, there is a long way to go yet before for downloads to play out. And I think downloads are a really useful transition technology. They bridge the gap because it's that sense of ownership. So it's familiarity of what the CD used to be. But in terms of what Apple does, I think Ben sort of hit upon a really interesting point where they have to take it slowly. They have a huge responsibility now that they account for so much of the market. If they got a streaming product that was so good but priced wrongly, they could decimate music sales within a year or two by driving everyone into something that's too good value for money. And I think the final thing I say about Apple is they are beginning to feel the weight of being a mass market company now. You look at it in how the slow evolution of the iPhone compared to how it used to evolve. Looking at the relatively slow evolution of iTunes. 10 years ago, 7 years ago, 8 years ago even, they could push more because they had this hardcore, group of tech aficionados. Now the mainstream, and you've got to lead the mainstream slowly through product iteration, and they've got to behave a lot more like Microsoft than they do traditional Apple these days.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's just finish off by just getting your impressions about iTunes 11. It rolled up last week, so I didn't talk about it last week because I wanted people to have a bit of a play with it and have a feel for it and see what they thought about the interface. Because as Mark said, there's a huge proportion of people that use iTunes as their daily source of music, the way they consume their music collection. So this fairly important shift in the way the interface looks, even if to us it looks relatively tame, it could be significant for a majority of other users. So Ben, what's your thoughts on the new iTunes and what the impact of the interface could be in the consumption of content at large?
I felt a little underwhelmed um, by the change. I mean, maybe I haven't spent enough time with it, but it looked pretty cosmetic. It's nice, and I think it just from a design perspective, it's important to play with the look and just keep it fresh. So that's a good thing. But I mean, just personally, in the way I use iTunes, I think that their bigger problem is functional with the iTunes Match and iTunes in the Cloud feature, which I've been disappointed with. I've found it clunky and slow, and it fails, shockingly frequently for a company like Apple.
Yeah.
And I think that features like that are going to be important to keep people interested in iTunes. It's already clear what it does just as a download service and as a music player. But I think that the cloud stuff and the syncing, that to me, that's very important to keep it fresh and really to give people a reason to keep playing with it and keep being, to keep enjoying it. So I've been disappointed with that so far, and they say that they've integrated iCloud to it, better into it. I don't know. So far, I'm just not thrilled with the way iCloud actually functions.
Yeah, sure. Andy, what's your take on the new iTunes, and do you feel like you would use it more given the new features, the mini player and stuff like that, or less after this update?
I don't know about using it more, but I mean, I don't know. I don't dislike it. I wouldn't necessarily say I was underwhelmed by it, but I wasn't expecting it to be anything more than it really is. I mean, it's simplified. It runs faster for me. That's all I want from it, really. But other kind of things that could have been plugged into it that people have talked about that haven't been. I'll get them elsewhere. That's not what like iTunes is really just what I want to play my MP3s, and it does that.
Yeah, and it's interesting though because iTunes is still called iTunes, but it does so much more now because in the last 4 years the name seems obsolete. Do you think it's weird they haven't decided to change it?
Yeah, I thought they might, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense given that it controls all the content that they put out. So it's a strange name, but I suppose it's a recognizable name. It's also almost a name that's become a sound more than a description of what it is.
It's an incredibly valuable brand name. They would have been stupid to throw it away, I think. I mean, that's just my 2 cents.
Sure, absolutely. Mark, have you played with it? What's your feel for it?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said so far. It's definitely predominantly cosmetic. I also think it's probably an iterative step onto something a bit bolder. I think the problem which iTunes has, which hasn't been solved with this iteration, is that when the iTunes player first came out, it did one set of things really well. And as more and more the functionality of the devices have spread out, iTunes itself has had to do more and more. So you've ended up with a sort of an increasingly bloated player, which doesn't quite do everything quite as well as it should have. Now, it's interesting here that they've essentially siloed off each of the different forms of content into one little bucket at the top. And I'm wondering whether that means they're actually preparing for different versions of iTunes. I'm not sure that's the right way to go. They are. I also read some criticism that iTunes is trying to be a player and a store and a management player. You shouldn't be trying to do all these things in one place. Why not? Why should that be split across 3 or 4 different services? I want it all in one place, and I want more of my digital music experiences joining together, not splitting up. So I think it's still the best what it does, and I think there's a huge amount more that can be done, and I know that Apple know that as well, and this is an iterative step. But I think that's a fundamental challenge they've got to get to in the next couple of years, is how to balance being bloated versus trying to meet the disparate needs of the media consumers on their multimedia devices.
Well, thanks so much for being on the show, guys. I think I'm gonna draw it to a close and just ask if there's anything that you would like to plug in terms of blogs or publications or anything that you would like to or your Twitter account. So starting with Andy, anything your end?
Oh, I'm on Twitter. I'm just Andy Malt. It's Malt. Not to compete, but the latest edition of our podcast just came out.
Yeah, great.
If you go to website.com, you'll find that there.
It's a great listen. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
And Ben?
If you want to follow me on Twitter, it's my last name, Sisario. And just, thanks for having me on the show. I enjoyed the conversation.
That's great. And Mark, anything on your end?
I'm on Twitter too, Mark_Mulligan. I also, one little thing to sneak in, I'm just launching a media innovation consultancy with a couple of other analysts and consultants. So if you want to check that out, it's Midia, MIDIA, MediaConsulting.com.
That's great. Perfect. Well, thanks so much for being on the show, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks.